Welcome. This is the mess hall. This is the elevator where they would bring them up. The guards would be up here. The guards would have no contact whatsoever with the prisoners. They would line in at 5,000 total capacity. When finished, back to the quarry fields.
Jeremy Bentham was a big thinker, born at a time where the values and ideas that had held true for centuries were being actively challenged. Bentham had bold new ideas of how the world should be working. He believed in a fair, equal world centuries before the civil rights pioneers that we think of today. From equality of the sexes, to the decriminalisation of homosexuality, to the need to separate church and state, to the concept of animal rights, Bentham's beliefs would very much shape the world in ways he couldn't have foreseen, nor could anyone have predicted upon his passing in 1832. After his morbidly ambitious auto-icon was laid to rest, his ideas festered and developed, and shy of 170 years later, we would see some of his biggest dreams become reality. But at the same time, in another corner of the world, we would see a demonstration of one of his other theories draw to a sharp close. The Panopticon prison was, like many of Bentham's ideas, an ambitious reform of what currently existed, and in Cuba, the closest replica was just about to be decommissioned.
A building circular, the prisoners in their cells occupying the circumference, the officers in the centre. By blinds and other contrivances, the inspectors concealed from the observation of the prisoners, hence the sentiment of a sort of omnipresence. The whole circuit reviewable with little or without any change of place. One station in the inspection part affording the most perfect view of every cell.
The Panopticon in many ways feels like an extension of Bentham's humanist philosophies. Its core goal is to reform the way that prisoners within prisons live their lives, and in essence enforce a positive way of life upon all its inhabitants. In his own words, those inside the prisons would have their morals reformed and health preserved. Prisoners could be watched at any moment with no indication that they were indeed being watched. For all they knew, they were always being watched. And as such, their behaviour should therefore be modified, theoretically resulting in better behaved inmates. There was to be no concept of privacy, of secrecy, or lack of judgment. You were under the constant expectation of surveillance, even if it was theoretically impossible. For all the prisoners could know, there may not even be a guard in the watchtower. But there was an expectation. The idea, while revolutionary and unprecedented, would have been unnecessary or potentially undesirable. There was no need to rehabilitate society's worst individuals, as they served only an expendable purpose to the elite and aristocracy. Bentham would fervently try to promote his idea during his life, ultimately spending a great deal of his own wealth attempting to have the idea put into fruition. And while after his death buildings inspired by the idea were built, no prison followed his tenets exactly to the letter. But there was one exceptionally close attempt. While the phrase Cuban dictatorship today conjures up images of a socialist nature, in the 20s and 30s the image would have almost certainly been of Gerardo Machado y Morales. Elected in 1925, he began to orchestrate heavy restrictions on the freedoms of the population, resulting in the formation of a burgeoning police state. Of course, such a state would need facilities to handle the many it sought to oppress, and in many ways, reconfigure. Impressed by another prison also built somewhat in line with Bentham's design, Morales ordered the construction of the Presidio Modelo, in English, the model prison. The complex consisted of 5 panopticon structures, with the ability to store thousands of prisoners in space normally suited for far less. The prison was exceptionally vertical, with 5 stories of accommodation included, housing hundreds of cells. Situated on the Isle of Youth, this would become the country's central prison upon its opening in 1931. On the surface, this would seem to be a faithful construction of Bentham's utopian prison, but unlike Bentham's noble intentions, Morales aimed to use this for repression over rehabilitation. The fear that prisoners had of being watched at all times would continue, but its purpose was not to reframe the character of the criminal underworld. Morals were not to be reformed, but to be silenced. Health saw an even steeper decline with cramped and fettered living conditions. The initial volume of prisoners within the complex was to be 2,000. By the time of the Cuban Revolution, this had tripled. One complex held the eating facilities, and according to urban legend, only total silence was permitted within the dining centre, forcing many to eat without cutlery to avoid strict punishment. An almost in complete violation of Bentham's principles, a labour camp was established with expectedly terrible conditions. By 1950, well after Morales' reign had ended, many of the prisoners were still political dissidents. Unlike Bentham's goal of rehabilitation, it had instead encouraged those within the prison not to reform their own thinking, but to have a desire to overthrow what had placed them within the prison. Almost all of the major Cuban revolutionary figures spent a great deal of time within the prison, and within the first decade of his rule, Castro had turned the Modelo into a museum in an effort to educate those of the human suffering that had occurred within the prison. Of course, this education ignores and continues to ignore the current status of the Cuban penal system. Bentham will likely never see his utopian reformatory prison exist, but his spirit and ideology lives on. Indeed, in many ways, you can trace the work of minimum security prisons in Scandinavia as being somewhat inspired by Bentham's ideology. While his biggest architectural theory may not have existed, and quite rightly, his forward-thinking views on society have been cornerstones of classic liberalism ever since he envisioned them. In today's world, many have argued that society itself has adopted the model of Panopticon. Thanks to the digital information we knowingly sign away every day, the government or corporate interests could spy on you at any time, anywhere. Countries such as China are exceptionally open about such spying. As such, we have had to reframe and reform our own behaviour. But if recent political developments have seen, there is a deeper seated resentment of the system, as opposed to a need to comply. Maybe within the most oppressive panopticons that exist today lies people destined for a revolution to end it.
Or perhaps install their own.